So let's start the discussion on moral reasoning and moral decision making. First of all, moral reasoning and moral decision making are aligned pretty closely with business ethics. And ethics are the tools, the theories that we use, the process that we use to reason through making an ethical decision. And moral reasoning is reasoning through the standards that we use when we make those decisions. So, what is considered to be good? What is considered to be wrong? What is considered to be evil? What is considered to be right? All of those are based on the moral standards that we each hold ourselves to in terms of what is right or wrong. Sort of goes back to that inner compass, what I think is right or wrong, based on my own reasoning. And so ethics are the tools that we use to basically make those moral decisions. B.F. Goodrich, if we look at that case, B.F. Goodrich handled things very differently than Merck did. B.F. Goodrich was looking at the baseline decision about the standard about what would benefit the company. So what would be beneficial to us, whereas Merck was thinking about what would be beneficial for the local community. And both of them were not necessarily unethical or ethical. They were just different standards. Now, we can argue that Merck's decision were very ethical because of the tremendous impact it had on the community, but B.F. Goodrich also, um, you know, has certain moral standards that it believes in that should drive how people behave. If you look at that next question, what moral standards were reflected? Well, one engineer said that they had an obligation to do your best no matter what the cost. And so they were supposed to do their best, even if it cost them some money to do that. Then another believed it was wrong to lie and to endanger the lives of others. And so for them, those are the moral standards that they hold for themselves. And he also believed that integrity was good and dishonesty was bad. So each standard, the moral standards that we use when we're making a decision whether or not something is ethical, is all based on those standards of the individual or the group about what is right or wrong. And as we'll see, there are some ethical theories that hold individual assessments of standards as right or wrong as the ethical way to be, whereas others depend on the community to determine what is right or wrong. And virtue ethics are an example of that the community determines what is considered to be ethical or unethical. So that's how that would play itself out. So let's talk about the difference between moral and non-moral standards. A moral standard has to do with what we believe to be good or bad, morally good or morally bad, based on ethics. So what that means is any ethical decisions that we need to make. Should I choose A or should I choose B? Or should I do A? Should I do B? Should I help this person or help that person? Or let's go back to Merck. Should we try to sell the product or should we try to give it away? That's an ethical dilemma. And the moral standard that we hold ourselves to is who is going to judge me and what is the thing against which I'm comparing my behaviors. So something becomes a moral standard or a moral norm or a moral good or a moral bad for that matter, when we are comparing it to something else regarding our ethical behaviors. So, okay, and they're usually expressed as rules about how we're supposed to behave. So when we have ethical compliance programs in organizations decide these are the ethical norms that we expect of you. We expect you not to cheat. We expect you not to steal money. And some of those issues are legal, but some of them are also in gray areas where legally you can do something, but the company decides this is not appropriate behaviors. We don't want you to do this. And so they become the rules that are set up regarding ethical behaviors, and what is considered to be ethical and what is not ethical. So where do those moral standards come from? Well, I've already told you. They can come from external sources such as family, friends, societal influences like our local community or my religion or my, the people I go to school with, etc. And those sources of moral standards are what we call our external compass. Then we have our internal compass, which is more about reflecting on our own moral standards and what our internal compass tells us is the right or wrong thing to do. Sometimes that can be influenced by external things, but oftentimes for people who are driven by internal compasses, they just have this strong sense of what's right or wrong, regardless of what society says or their friends and family says. They stand consistent and strong, even when the internal standards are considered to be, when external standards are considered to be inappropriate. So, for example, it was legal for people to own slaves, to have enslaved people. And the law said it was okay to do that. And there were many people who did do it because the law said they could. But there were plenty of people that decided there's something that doesn't feel right about owning a human being. Owning somebody, even if they are of a different color, they still are being owned, by somebody else. And so for them, that internal standard, regardless of what society and friends and the law said, they recognized that that was the right thing. It was a wrong thing to do to own people, and it was the right thing to be against slavery. And ultimately, the law caught up to moral outrage, and eventually the laws changed, but it took a while. It took a law, it took a war for us to get there. So what's a non-moral standard? Well, non-moral standards or norms have to do more with just general things like, what salad fork you should use, when should you, use your phone, and should you speak out loud on your phone with a speakerphone. They're just sort of general rules of behavior that don't have anything to do with ethics and norms. That's usually the law. The law can also address ethical issues, but it doesn't always. As I said, right, we had laws that said it was okay to own people. So it was a law about certain behaviors. Even if the non-moral standard was the law says it's okay, the moral standard says, but that's not really a good thing to do. We shouldn't own human beings. Language standards in terms of grammar and the way that we speak. Even if you go to Mexico versus Spain, they both speak Spanish, but they have very different rules of the norms of the way you speak to each other and how you communicate, those sorts of things. So moral reasoning and moral decision making really comes down to the difference between sort of moral standards around ethical behaviors and ethical things and ethical decisions and ethical dilemmas, and non-moral, which is more about the day-to-day stuff that isn't about any kind of dilemma or any sort of larger scale ethical issues. It's simply about how do we behave, what is the expectation amongst people about how we should behave. There are 6 characteristics of moral standards and moral decision making. Number 1, moral standards cover serious matters, which basically means it's not casual, it's not something haphazard, that it is something that has to be incredibly serious, like pollution, attention to someone's health and safety, those sorts of things. Moral standards are preferred over other standards. So when we think about which standards are more important, the standards of success, including money, is not as important as the standards of moral correctness or moral good versus over moral bad. So it has to be, moral standards tend to be valued and preferred over other types of values because those are the things that guide us and are the things that affect our conscience, if you will. They're independent of authority. So even though the law, as I said in the previous slide, the law says that it is okay for us to own slaves, at the end of the day, it is of course not okay. So it's independent of the law, that we can agree that even though there is a law that says you can do something, we might be morally against it, and that's okay. We don't have to follow that law. Moral standards are universal. So when it comes to moral standards, it's not like it works in this situation, but not that it's situation, or it works for these people, but not these people. Moral standards are a standard across the board that everybody should adhere to. They are impartial, which means that you don't know, right? How it's going to impact you. All you know is a moral standard is a standard that is not biased by someone's interests or point of view or perspectives. It's simply an impartial, objective standard of what is right or wrong. And that's challenging, of course, because, you know, I might think a point of view is biased and someone else might not. But the most important thing that we have to pay attention to is ensuring that we are not letting our own personal bias influence us, but that we are working hard to be as objective and impartial as possible. And then lastly, it enlists special vocabulary and emotions. So there are clear words and emotions that are attached to moral standards and moral reasoning that we might not see elsewhere. This slide is a great example of the difference between moral and non-moral norms. For example, in group 1, there's a bunch of different norms, and group 2, there's a bunch of different norms. So I would like for you to take a moment to read them and to decide which one is the moral norm and which one is the non-moral norm. So I'll give you a moment here to consider that. By now you should have read each group. Group 1, do not harm other people. Do not steal what belongs to others. Do not lie to other people. This would be a moral norm. Group 2 are things like etiquette. Do not eat with your mouth open. Do not chew gum in class. That's a class policy, but that has nothing to do with ethics or values. Do not wear socks that do not match. That's a stylistic, subjective, standard that people set for themselves. And I laugh because I think about my own kids who liked to wear socks that were mismatched. They don't care. They're like, why does it matter? I'm just putting socks on. Like, you're right. Just do what you want to do. I'm good with that. Kids are crazy. What can you do? So you could see the clear difference here. Group 1 is all about values and behaviors about what can affect ourselves and other people in a profound and deep way. Ethical decisions are embedded in that. And then group 2 is, it's just simple rules of behavior, niceties about how we engage with each other, but they don't really get at deep ethical issues. So ethical standards require good reasons to hold them. So we need to, if we're going to engage in ethical standards, there has to be a good reason for it because it harms somebody else. It's a problem. It's a concern. And it has a tremendous impact on people. And as you saw from the textbook, right, the textbook discusses those senses of standards, and something is considered to be a moral standard when there's a serious consequence involved. So it's not, there's no serious consequence to which salad fork I would use, but there's definitely a serious consequence as to whether or not I should dump PCBs in a local body of water to dispose of, chemical wastes kind of things. So the chemical waste question or dilemma has a tremendous impact on people, has tremendous consequences. So of course we want to make sure we have a good reason for why we're holding those standards. We approach this notion of ethics either descriptively or normatively, as your textbook calls it. Descriptively or prescriptively or normative. Prescriptive and normative are sort of interchangeable. And descriptive is simply, what are we seeing? So I'm going to ask a group of people, do you believe that bribery is wrong? Or on average, do Americans believe that bribery is wrong? And I'm simply describing what people tell me. I'm not trying to come up with a truism, an absolute, a standard. I'm simply describing what I see. Then the bigger question is bribery wrong? It's a larger question, an umbrella meta question. It's not about what Americans believe versus another country, but more, is it right or wrong across the board consistently, no matter where you go? And of course, there are many things that are in gray areas. For example, you might say killing somebody is absolutely wrong. But what if it's self-defense? What if it's in defense of your child who was harmed? What if it's in war? Now you might say, well, war is unethical. Maybe so. Some people think war is perfectly fine. It's legal. It's ethical because we are defending our territory. We're defensively supporting ourselves. Others would argue, pacifists would argue, that it's wrong across the board, that killing somebody else, no matter the reason, is wrong. Obviously, the truth is somewhere in the in-between, at least it is for me, but nonetheless, we can see that that even with prescriptive things, it's incredibly challenging to find that one norm, the thing that ought to be. Something that is prescriptive is how it should be. Is bribery wrong? It's prescriptive, saying no, it's wrong, or yes, it's right. And it's a higher standard that we hold, and it's really how things ought to be. Business ethics studies moral standards as applied to business. So what that means is, as we talked about already, that ethics is the study of ethics in philosophy, and business ethics is about the moral standards that we hold in business. Is it okay for us to work our employees 70 hours a week? Is it ethical or moral for us to dump pollutants into bodies of water? Is it ethical for us to price gouge? All of these are important questions. And of course, many of these issues are addressed by laws, but not all. So business ethics are typically sorted into what we call systemic issues, like sort of how the system should work, versus corporate behaviors versus individual behaviors within corporations.